Jim Grinnell, if you didn't catch that, and I am Esther's dad, emotional and proud, getting to the age where I cry at commercials. So anyway, I wanted to start by reading a little bit of Esther's bio here. If I can pull it up, and I can't. So anyway, super proud of Esther. I could tell so many stories, but I'm going to refrain from that, honey, so that, well, maybe one. When she was born, I said to Laura, "Oh, honey, I feel so bad for Esther. Her sisters are so pretty, and Esther's just so ugly. And yet, she's just, gorgeous, and so what did I know, huh?" But let's see. Esther's always been a high-impact person. The Lord just seems to have his hand upon her in a special way. And now in her work against trafficking, she's spoken before Congress. She's currently vice chair of the U.S. Department of Transportation on a study that gives reports 3 times a year. Is that right, honey? Every 3 years to Secretary Buttigieg. So she's having some political clout, which is really exciting. But on a spiritual note, I would just want to introduce her this way and say that in 3 John, verse 4, it says, "I have no greater joy than my children walking in the truth." And I don't want to quibble with Scripture, of course, but I have an additional joy, and that joy is that she is having a high impact in the kingdom of God. She's being fruitful, as well as walking in the truth. So her mom and I are just incredibly, incredibly proud of her. So I want to introduce her now, my daughter Esther Goetsch. Come on up, Esther.
Well, I do a lot of public speaking, but it is not every day that I get my dad to introduce me, so you'll forgive me if I also get emotional. All right, well, I want to thank you this morning for having me, especially to Tim and my dad for inviting me to this special group to share some of the work that I do. I know some of you may be aware human trafficking has gotten a lot more attention recently, right? It's come up in movies and across, news channels. And so I'm really pleased to be here to be able to share a little bit of information with you all about what human trafficking is, what it isn't, how it shows up in our world as well as our own communities here. And then hopefully share some tangible ways that maybe you can think about getting involved yourselves. I do want to let you know that the topic that I'll be handling today is quite difficult. And I will be discussing sex trafficking, sexual exploitation, and rape. All of it will be handled in a professional manner, so you don't need to worry about that. But I do want to let you know it may be a little uncomfortable at times. But I do believe it's in those uncomfortable spaces that often new growth and new understanding flourishes. I imagine many of you have kids in your life. Anybody in here have children, grandchildren, nieces, nephews, folks that you love and care about who are minors? I think you'll find this information especially helpful when you think about those folks in your life as well. All right, so let's jump right in. Am I loud enough? Can everyone hear me? I may move my head and get a little bit away from the lapel, but and I will also save some time at the end for questions, so we'll have plenty of time for that as well. All right, so let's jump right in. So Truckers Against Trafficking, or TAT as we call it for short, is a Denver-based international anti-human trafficking organization. At our core, we are about targeted systems change, and really that starts with changing hearts and minds about the issue of human trafficking. We are going after those hearts and minds, specifically in the transportation industry, in order to raise up a mobile army of transportation professionals who can assist law enforcement in the recognition and reporting of human trafficking so that more victims are recovered. So in our name, we are Truckers Against Trafficking, and that's certainly how we got started. But now 14 years after our founding, we have scaled dramatically and now include both the bus and energy industry, as well as local drivers and in-home personnel, delivery personnel. In 2019, we expanded into Canada and have also replicated our model in Mexico. So we're working across North America. In addition to private industry that we work with, we have also built partnerships with federal, state, local, and tribal law enforcement and government agencies all across the US and Canada. We've partnered with law enforcement leaders in all 50 states and provide training to those agencies, assuring that officers who respond to human trafficking calls are going to take a victim-centered approach and keep that at the forefront at all times. So these partnerships and our programs together have increased reports of human trafficking, arrests, prosecutions, and recovery of victims. All right, so what is human trafficking? Let's just start there so we're all on the same page. So human trafficking is the exploitation of human beings through force, fraud, or coercion for the purposes of either commercial sex, so think pornography, stripping, brothels, street-based prostitution, and most typically pimps, as well as forced labor or labor trafficking. So of course we think of sweatshops, agricultural fields, maybe restaurants. Workers being forced to work long, hard hours with little to no pay. And all of this is being driven by a trafficker, a victimizer, someone who is in control and making a profit off of someone else's back. And victims often find themselves in situations they literally cannot get out of. Oftentimes when I talk about human trafficking, the crime of human smuggling comes up. These two terms are often incorrectly interchangeably used, but they're actually two distinct crimes. So smuggling is a crime against a country's immigration law. It's when somebody enters a country they don't have permission to be, it's when somebody smuggles someone across a border they don't have permission to be in, usually for a large sum of money. Whereas human trafficking is a crime against a person, and movement does not need to occur. So somebody can be trafficked out of their own home, for example, and movement is not required. In order to provide a better understanding of this crime, I want to break it down to 4 simple truths. So truth number 1 is that slavery still exists. Of course, at one time, there was state-sanctioned ownership, state-sanctioned slavery in our country, as we all know. And while it is now illegal to own another human being, the reality of this crime shows that traffickers enslave, torture, and profit off their victims on a routine basis. In regards to the scope of this crime on a global level, there are over 150 billion victims of human trafficking globally that generate over 150 billion in annual profits. So what's at the core of this crime? Money, greed. The National Human Trafficking Hotline reports that trafficking is happening in all 50 states. There is no state where this crime does not occur. It is happening in every one of our backyards. And while there are plenty of adult victims, there are thousands of children in the United States each year that are prostituted and trafficked. And just to really bring the reality of this home, national nonprofit Polaris reports that victims may be forced to have sex up to 20 times a day. And really that should read raped up to 20 times a day. I'm sure in this room there are those of you who know someone who has been a victim of, sexual assault or rape. And if you do, you know how one incident can literally turn a person's life upside down and take years and years of recovery. Now imagine that kind of violence happening over and over again, day after day. This is the reality for victims of sex trafficking. And it's especially important to know that oftentimes, and we'll talk about this a little more, victims may enter these situations as children. So imagine that kind of abuse happening over and over again. All right, we've talked about truth so far, but I do need to dispel one myth, which is that trafficking always starts with kidnapping. Has anyone heard that myth before or believed that about human trafficking? So while kidnapping certainly can and does occur in human trafficking cases, more commonly there is some pre-existing relationship between the victim and the trafficker. It could be a casual online relationship, a friendship. It could be a friend or family member. It could be an intimate partner relationship. And with child trafficking in particular, almost half of identified cases of child trafficking began with some connection to a family member. What we need to understand about modern day slavery, as we call it, is that there is so much manipulation involved that traffickers often don't need physical chains or locked doors. They use these invisible chains of force, fraud, and coercion to keep their victims under their control. So force is, of course, everything you can think of. This includes one-off beatings, brutal assaults. Victims are raped, gang raped, often forced into drug addiction, mutilated, tortured, knifed, and shot. And I can tell you, and I'm sure the folks who work with victims directly can also verify this. I've worked with countless survivors over the years, and every one of them experienced this kind of violence and brutality at some point in their trafficking. Force is almost always present at some point. Fraud consists of false employment offers or lying about working conditions. So maybe promising, to that young teenager a fantastic job in an exciting city or as a model, and then exploiting that person into the sex trade. So anytime lying about working conditions exists, fraud is present. But without a doubt, coercion, that last bullet point, is the most powerful means that traffickers use to keep their victims under their control. And this really consists of threats to life, threats to safety, threats to family members, where the pimp often plays the role of the daddy or the boyfriend. It could be, they're controlling someone's money or identifying documents. It could be threats to a young mother that they will call child welfare services if she doesn't do exactly what they're telling her to do, or that they may hurt her child, right? It could be threats to an undocumented immigrant, that they will turn them over to DHS and be deported. It could be, what we see a lot, is threats to, maybe an insecure teenager about a sex video that they're gonna post in their community. So their parents, their teachers, their peers will see. But if they do what that trafficker is telling them to do, they'll keep it quiet. These are the types of psychological abuses that are so powerful in the life of a victim. And it's especially true when, especially in sex trafficking cases, the victims themselves don't identify as victims. Usually they think, this is what love is. Maybe this is all I'm worth. Maybe this is what I have to do to make somebody take care of me or love me. Of course, that seems crazy to us, but when you think about how entrenched these psychological abuses are, and that oftentimes, at least when it starts, it's a younger female with an older male who's grooming them, this is an all too common reality. And here I also want to point out that according to federal definition of human trafficking, force, fraud, and coercion only need to be proved in adult human trafficking cases. So any minor involved in a commercial sex act is automatically a victim of human trafficking. It doesn't matter if that kid says they want to be there, they know what they're doing, that child needs an adult to stand up for them and do what they cannot. So you may be asking, well, how does this happen, right? Well, traffickers prey upon vulnerabilities, and they frequently do target children using their hopes, dreams, immaturities, fears, and disappointments as weapons to exploit their bodies for profit. And so while anyone could be susceptible to the manipulative practices that traffickers employ, there are individuals who are at a higher risk of being trafficked. And those are populations that already have some kind of vulnerability that they are experiencing. So, children who are in the foster care, young adults who have recently aged out of the foster care. It could be those experiencing homelessness or runaway youth. Members of the LGBTQ community who may be experiencing rejection or disapproval at home or in their communities, and folks who come from already abusive backgrounds are going to be at particularly high risk of traffickers. All right, truth number 2. Even though you may have a preconceived idea of what a pimp might look like or what a trafficker looks like, the reality is that traffickers can be anyone. We need to remember that just as this crime knows no racial, gender, or socioeconomic bounds when it comes to who could be a victim of human trafficking, the same is true for who could be the perpetrator. So here's a snapshot of individuals who have been convicted of human trafficking here in the U.S. You have a former firefighter, an Army veteran. You have an 8th grade math teacher, this woman in the middle of the screen who was trying to traffic children, her students, to Morocco. You have the Indian Consulate General of New York State a few years ago who was trafficking workers, domestic workers, out of her home. And so this, as we said before, is a crime of power, control, and greed, and traffickers come from all types of backgrounds, and as noted, can also be family members. And there are actually 2 groups of people who exploit victims, right? The first are obviously the traffickers. The other group that that exploit our youth and others who find themselves in these desperate situations are the buyers of commercial sex. Because the reality is, if there were no demand for commercial sex, there would be no victims. As we said, traffickers would move on to something else that's more lucrative if there was no money to be made. So we cannot address the issue of human trafficking without also addressing the issue of demand. All right, truth number 4. While we all want to believe that maybe human trafficking happens in third world countries or faraway places or big city centers, we know this simply is not true. Human trafficking is a local crime. It's happening in our state, here in Oklahoma, and even in our own communities. This takes less than 2 minutes to Google headlines from right here in our own state. And I think the gentleman I was talking to earlier said there was a case this week he saw out of, I don't know if it was out of Tulsa or out of Oklahoma City. But this is an issue that affects all of us. Okay, so now I want to bring it a little bit closer to home, at least in my world of transportation, and connect this with what does this actually look like in reality, and how are there connections with the trucking industry? So in January of 2015, an RV pulled into a truck stop in Virginia. Police were soon called to the scene, and when they arrived and after interviewing the occupants of the vehicle, the horrific story made headlines, national headlines. There was a young woman about 20 years old, so she wasn't a minor, had been lured 2 weeks prior out of her home in Iowa by these acquaintances that she had. In those 2 weeks, she was beaten, raped, burned all over her body using instruments that they heated on the RV stove. That was their form of branding her and threatening her. They told her if she called home or tried to tell anyone what was going on, that they would kill her family. And she knew that they knew where her family was because they already had that pre-existing relationship. She was dying from malnutrition and the torture that she was subjected to. She was being sold on Craigslist through sex ads where men were purchasing her and then arriving to the RV at the truck stops to rape her by these two, Laura Sorensen and Aldir Hadza. Had the call not been made that brought law enforcement out to that truck stop, doctors said that she would have died within the next few days. And remember, she's not a minor, so there's no missing posters. There's no law enforcement agencies looking for this woman. You better believe those traffickers knew that. This is what human trafficking looks like right here in the U.S. So, in response to these realities, Truckers Against Trafficking began in 2009 with a mission to educate, equip, empower, and mobilize members of the trucking, bus, and energy industries to combat human trafficking as part of their everyday jobs. We recognize that professional drivers, through their sheer numbers, their extensive travel, and the very nature of their jobs could provide that extra set of eyes and ears to law enforcement in helping recover and report and recover victims of human trafficking. Especially since in the course of their everyday jobs, professional drivers are often in places where they may come in contact with a potential victim of human trafficking in the course of their everyday routines. So while this list is not exhaustive, here are some of the places where professional drivers within these industries may commonly come in contact with victims of human trafficking. And here's the deal. Traffickers are counting on everyone thinking that the person being sold out there is out there on their own. Maybe she likes doing this. Maybe she's making money for college, right? That's what they're counting on. And they're counting on everybody turning a blind eye, looking the other way, and going down the road. But what if all drivers knew the signs to recognize potential human trafficking victims and report what they're seeing? Imagine how many victims might be recovered and traffickers arrested. And so that is our goal. We work alongside our industry partners to empower companies to make an impact on this crime. So whether it's working with C-suite executives or HR departments or the drivers themselves, we help equip them to integrate fighting human trafficking as part of their corporate core values. We really want, we work with UPS and FedEx and Amazon. We want these companies to make fighting human trafficking a part of their very DNA as a company, something that they value all the way through. And so we provide free industry-specific training for drivers and employees. We also help those companies adopt policies that fight demand and hold those people who are buying sex accountable. We activate corporate employees around some of the root causes that we'll talk about, helping to mitigate some of those vulnerabilities that make individuals in our communities susceptible to traffickers. And then we equip industry members with resources that they can take back into their own communities, their own dinner tables. And we'll talk a little bit more about those in a few minutes as well. So first, we saturate these industries with training materials, as I just discussed. The cornerstone of our training is a documentary-style training video that's specific to the industry we're working with. Along with that is a wallet card that I've got some examples here in the back of the room later if you want to take a look that talk about the red flags for drivers to be looking for. And then if they see potential trafficking, exactly what to do, who to call, and what types of information law enforcement need in order to open an investigation on that case. The great thing is we exist to provide all of this free of charge to our partners. And so as a nonprofit, we're able to provide all these types of resources to companies at no cost. So I want to show you just a quick trailer of our very first training video for over-the-road truck drivers.
My son and I were driving through Oklahoma City, had the radio on, and the guy comes on the radio, "Hey, anybody want any underage girls?"
This one, she didn't even look 13, 14 years old. She had a little mini skirt on.
A 14-year-old, 15-year-old is not doing this on their own.
You have to wonder who's behind them.
They have a pimp or whatever you want to call it, a trafficker.
Sex trafficking is a form of modern-day slavery. It's when traffickers are using force, fraud, and coercion to compel an individual to engage in commercial sex. And traffickers are not only exploiting the victims, but they're also exploiting these locations. Everything from commercial front brothels to residential brothels to hotels and motels to truck stops to street-based prostitution. A lot of the exploitation is happening online. That's where a lot of the connections are being made.
Nobody wakes up and says, gosh, I'd really like to sell myself on the streets today. That is something that is being directed by the victimizer, by the trafficker.
Here we are, I'm 15 years old, my cousin's 14, and we're here at a truck stop, being forced to work it, and we're young girls, terrified out of our minds.
The trucking industry is in a unique position because they actually will be in the locations that pimps will bring in their victims.
Truckers Against Trafficking is a grassroots organization. It comes alongside the trucking industry, recognizing that they're the eyes and ears of our nation's highways. They're in places that most people aren't, and that they can recognize potential victims of human trafficking more than the rest of us.
You're talking about a really highly trained group of individuals that are seeing trafficking, they know where to report it, they're reporting it right away, and as a result, we have seen countless victims who've been recovered by law enforcement.
When we talk about who's driving change in this area, we have to talk about the American trucking industry.
Thank God what saved me was that truck driver that called in and said, hey, this is whoever at the truck stop, and we have some girls out here that look pretty young.
Oh, that trucker. The one that made him look up. Boy, I owe him a lot. And if he ever sees this, thank you, thank you, thank you.
Truck driver with my husband Bob.
Been a 16-year veteran of over-the-road truck driving.
Been driving for 26 years.
And I am a trucker against trafficking.
And I'm a trucker against trafficking.
I'm a trucker against trafficking.
And I am a trucker against trafficking.
Okay, so as you can see, that's the type of training videos we offer to our industry partners. So every video is specific to that industry and has those same components of a survivor who was aided by that particular type of industry personnel, whether a bus driver or a truck driver or a truck stop personnel, and then law enforcement talking about the critical partnerships that these industries can aid with. So. In recognition of the fact that without buyers, as I mentioned earlier, there would be no victims of sex trafficking, TAT launched its Man-to-Man campaign a few years ago, and this was to help shape the cultural conversation around the issue of demand, right? Recognizing that many of the industries that we work with are predominantly male-dominated industries. And we encourage our partners, as I mentioned, to adopt policies around demand reduction. It might surprise you, but most companies do not have policies on the books that prohibit their employees from using company time or company work product to purchase commercial sex. And yet studies find that's exactly what many buyers do, is they're having these interactions between the 8 to 5 business hours. And so enlisting companies in having a zero tolerance policy, again, helps fight that demand at its root. And so one of the materials I want to make you guys aware of is our anti-demand training video. I didn't show you a trailer of that, but we do have those, and I have some hard copies in the back of the room. Happy to send you digital as well. And so we have an anti-demand video. It's about 22 minutes long, and a brochure and wallet cards as well. And these materials really explore the connection between pornography, sex addiction, and sex trafficking. And it is not done in a shaming way at all. That is not TAT style, but rather helping men empower other men to understand those connections and connect those dots and be able to share about their experiences, in an empowering, vulnerable, but positive way. And so, and actually this campaign came to us from men, from drivers actually in the trucking industry that said, hey, we don't buy sex, we think it's wrong, but we hear men talking in these ways that objectify women or that are leading in that direction. Can you help us? How can we shape the cultural conversation around sex buying? And so these are things that are not transportation specific, the actual videos themselves, so they can be used in church groups, men's groups, addiction groups, things like that. So that could be a takeaway resource for you guys in your congregations and networks. As I mentioned earlier, children are highly at risk, no matter where they come from or what type of home lives they have. They're still developing, of course. They're relying on caring adults to help meet their physical needs, such as shelter and food, right? But they also have a lot of emotional needs. They're looking for belonging and acceptance, right? They may be battling with self-esteem or bullying or loneliness. And all of those things, all of those needs are what the traffickers want to step in and meet. And so if we think about our kids being online, having conversations with people on the internet or wherever they may be, sometimes away from parents' knowledge, right, in their own rooms. Through social media and online, traffickers unfortunately have a direct pipeline to a population of youth who, as part of how they're created, are vulnerable, right? And so I want to talk a little bit about some of the things TAT does to help protect children from traffickers, as well as some of takeaway resources for you guys as well. Because unfortunately, as you see here, there are far too many children in our country that are being trafficked, and it does include a lot of familial trafficking as well. In fact, we have a survivor on our staff who was trafficked by her mother starting at the age of 6. She still attended school in the day. She attended ballet lessons, right? She looked to all in the community, right, like what a normal child would be experiencing, and yet what was happening behind closed doors was really horrific. And so one of the things that we do is we train bus drivers on recognizing the signs of human trafficking. In fact, the survivor that I just mentioned, she talks about how every day she boarded the bus to go to and from school. And that sometimes was the safest, she felt the safest once she was leaving her home on that school bus and at school. And bus drivers, if you think about it, are transporting these kids day in and day out to and from school and from their home. And sadly, traffickers do recruit out of schools, and some continue attending school during the day, even if they're being trafficked or groomed at night or on the weekends. And so those school bus drivers, they're able to notice changes in physical appearance or mood or behavior, or who is picking that kid up and dropping them off, or if there's manipulative behaviors happening between those adults and those children. Of course, all school personnel should be trained to detect the signs of human trafficking, not just school bus drivers. But the driver is in places that the principal, the teachers, the counselors are not. So TAP provides these free training materials for bus drivers that anyone can encourage their local school district to adopt. So if you want some of those materials, happy to send those as a follow-up. We have it as a really easy kind of digital toolkit that can be digital or print that you can take into your local school district and ask them to add the training for their school bus drivers. Okay, we already talked about how all of us have kids in our lives that we're impacted by and that we have an impact on. We've already talked about how vulnerable kids are already inherently. So if you think about the companies that TAT works with, they employ hundreds of thousands of people just like you and me that have kids in their lives. And so while we want to train their drivers to recognize the signs of potential trafficking in the course of their everyday jobs, it would be amiss if we didn't also equip all of those employees on how to talk to their own kids in their own homes, in their own communities, about how to stay safe. So we have a couple of resources. These are one-pagers that talk about how to talk to your kids about online safety, how to keep your kids safe online, how to talk to your kids about pornography and human trafficking specifically in age-appropriate terms. So again, these are resources that may be of use to you guys in your networks or congregations or communities, and I'm happy to send those as follow-ups as well. And along that note, some of the things that you can do as community members is get involved locally with organizations that are serving victims and survivors directly. It is a huge need across the country. There are not enough beds, there is not enough shelter, there are not enough trained individuals who are serving these victims. And so this is a list of a couple of organizations here in Oklahoma. We have the Spring here with us today that have been, vetted by, at least the Spring has been vetted by, and the Dragonfly Home, by the Office of the Attorney General here in Oklahoma, so, and as well as our own on-staff survivors who find it very important to make sure that any service provider we're recommending are going to be safe places for victims of human trafficking. So I encourage you to look up these organizations. I can send these after as well. These are great places to, support financially, to provide food donations or, clothes. There's constant needs, and I'm sure they could fill you in on what some of those needs are. Additionally, volunteering with at-risk youth as having a stable and loving adult in their life is excellent preventative work with some of those youth that we said were already at a particularly high risk of being trafficked. Here's just a statistic showing the reality out there. In the span of 5 years, 41% of the cases truckers have reported to the national hotline involved minors. Well, are you ready for some good news? The good news is that all of these efforts are working. To date, TAT has trained over 1.6 million industry professionals, and drivers have now made thousands of calls into law enforcement and the national hotline, resulting in hundreds of cases of victim recovery. And at the end of the day, all of these impressive numbers and programs lead to stories like the following. Like the two Travel Centers of America employees, Debo, a deputy, and Alan Bailey, let's see, they're over here on your screen, who closed out a 2-month investigation of 3 pimps who were trafficking over 20 victims online and on the streets because they were paying attention to what was happening in the hotel parking lot across from their truck stop in Jessup, Maryland. Or TAT trained driver Arian Taylor with that big, beautiful smile who provided safe haven to a young 19-year-old who was traveling with her friend and her friend's older boyfriend. At one point, the boyfriend told her what his intentions were, which was to prostitute her at the truck stops. And when she refused, he threw her out of the vehicle, left her in the middle of nowhere with no phone, no belongings. She didn't know where she was. And Arian Taylor had his TAT stickers proudly on his cab. And so she found him, he called the hotline, allowed her to sit safely in his cab while she talked to a victim specialist who was able to get her back home safely to her family. That one strikes a chord for me. I've got a 15-year-old beautiful daughter. I know many of you. My parents have a whole host of beautiful daughters between the ages of 15 and 20. And you can imagine it could be any of them. It could be any of them. Or the two lakefront line bus drivers that you see there holding the awards, who jumped into action when a female passenger on one of their buses told the driver that she was being held against her will and forced into prostitution by a male passenger also on the bus. Because of their training and quick thinking, they were able to get the alleged victim to safety. The suspect was arrested, and currently that pimp is on trial on human trafficking charges. Or finally, how about Kevin Kimmel, who happened to pull into that same Virginia truck stop as Laura Sorensen and Alder Hadza that I mentioned at the beginning of the presentation. Kevin saw men going to and from that RV that day. He saw them knock, enter, be in there for about 20 minutes, and come back later. He was pretty sure he was seeing prostitution happen, was still trying to decide what to do, if he should get involved. But it was when he saw that young woman try to peer out the RV window, only to have her violently ripped back by her hair, a black curtain covered, and a commotion ensue, that Kevin picked up the phone. It was his call that brought law enforcement out to that truck stop. And to this day, that young woman calls Kevin her guardian angel. He calls himself a trucker against trafficking. So what are your next steps, and how can you get involved? I'd encourage you to think through some of the things we've talked about and where your influence lies. Not everyone has to start a nonprofit or move mountains, but every small step makes an impact. Perhaps you can use the anti-demand materials that I shared with you to help fight demand in your congregations or with men's groups that you have touch points with. Perhaps you can do an outreach at local school districts and share with them the training for bus drivers. Or volunteer at risk and vulnerable youth in your community, or give of your time or resources to local service providers who are caring for those victims and survivors of human trafficking. And finally, we always end with, take this conversation back to your dinner tables, back to your spheres of influence, and talk to those kids in your life about what pimps really are and how to avoid those predators. Finally, human trafficking is one of the greatest human rights violations of our time. Each person has a role to play, as I mentioned. It doesn't matter how big or how small of a step it may be. It may be offering kindness and compassion when you see that individual out there and you get that gut feeling. Maybe those are some of the signs that Esther talked about. Maybe it's just offering, a glass of water or asking if they need help or if they're safe. Don't discount the small steps. Also, don't be afraid if you're being called to a bigger one. All of these are necessary in order for us to fight against the ignorance and apathy that pimps and traffickers are counting on, so that victims will no longer be hidden in plain sight. Here's my contact information. I also have cards in the back of the room, and as I said, I'm happy to answer any questions and or follow up with you specifically.
Jennifer, now we'll come to you with the microphone for the questions.
Yeah, so if you have a question, let me bring this mic to you. We're recording this session, and we want to be able to hear your questions. So, anybody have a question for Esther?
Yeah.
I just wanted to know if you do like a heat map or something for all your calls. Do you see hotspots across the country of where more calls are coming in?
Yeah, that's a good question. So TAT does not run a hotline, but Polaris is the national nonprofit that runs the United States National Hotline. This is a hotline that operates 24/7 specifically for human trafficking. So if you take one of our wallet cards, it has those numbers in the US, Canada, and Mexico of if you suspect human trafficking, where to call. In terms of their heat maps that I have seen, You do see different activity, but I would say, kind of within the anti-trafficking world, our best understanding of that is not necessarily it's indicative of higher areas of trafficking, but more awareness to make those calls. And so data around human trafficking is really hard to come by, again, because oftentimes victims don't self-identify as victims. Oftentimes with law enforcement, they're actually seeing the crime in other channels and they're not identifying it as human trafficking, so you miss a lot of victims there as well in the criminal justice system. But we do know that the more awareness there is, the more calls and reports of human trafficking do go up.
How can we help get the word out about your ministry, Tad? Because sadly, I've been here 50 years. It's also the first time I've heard about it.
Yeah.
How can we help get this word spread?
Yeah, thank you. I mean, getting on our website, we have our social channels. I don't know if you guys are on Facebook, Instagram. That's really where we have the bulk of our kind of grassroots following, if you will. Those are where truckers are interacting, bus drivers, and we're interacting directly with folks that we serve. I think just sharing about the information, you can go on our website and learn more, and I don't know, just brag about us wherever you are. I mean, probably the reason you haven't heard about us is because what's really unique about TAT is that we dive deep in our area of expertise. So within the transportation world, we're pretty well known, but to the general public, probably not as much. Thank you.
Do you know if Tulsa Public Schools, Owasso, Bixby, and Jenks have offered this training to their bus drivers?
It's a great question. I don't believe they have. We have worked with the Department of Education here in Oklahoma. They have put out, bulletins with our information. They haven't required the training, though, at local school district level. So that's why we encourage individuals who are in those school districts to take the information to those transportation departments. So we may have a presence at some of the school districts here. I don't know off the top of my head which ones, but I could get that information for you.
So we need to help facilitate that.
Yeah, absolutely.
Would Truckers Against Trafficking be the best resource to equip specifically pastors or youth pastors to recognize the same things that you're training truckers to recognize? Because you may remember, I don't know, some years ago, Esther, 5-6 years ago, we had a girl from our church neighborhood who came to the church, and she was there for a while. We realized that she was in a tough family situation, and then she disappeared. And I saw her at a local restaurant, and she looked different. Something didn't ring true to me. So I called the youth leaders at that point. Do you know where she is anymore? No, we haven't seen her for a while. Called you in, and we tried to strategize, but she disappeared. She was in the wind. It would have been nice to be able to see some of those things in advance and maybe intervene earlier before she disappeared.
Yeah, great question. So I will say, some of the general indicators that you'd find on our wall card on our website, they are going to be applicable across the board. But TAT would not be the best suited to educate, especially those working directly with youth. There are phenomenal organizations out there who are doing that type of work. As far as with church leaders, I'm not sure. I'd have to actually do some research on that and get back to you. But for those working with youth, there's an organization called I Empathize. They actually are the ones who created a number of our early training videos. So they know the issue very well, and they develop compelling multimedia, age-appropriate information to get into the schools. So they actually have school curriculum for youth, and actually I did it when I was working with the youth group at TCF with that smaller group of girls. It's called, what is it called? Empower Youth, and it's more of like a leadership facilitated. So teachers could do it, youth pastors could do it, where you're helping kids think about empathy, right, and think about some of the signs that they may see in themselves or in others that are those vulnerabilities that are opening them up to potential exploitation, and then also kind of how to counteract that as a youth by being empathetic to those around you, right? And being able to have sort of that different lens on. So I can share those resources with you as well. But I would say in general, I mean, just once you know the signs, putting together a plan for if you may encounter a victim like that young woman. And I would say the two most critical pieces are knowing what local services there are available. So the shelters and the homes that are available. So that list would be critical. So that you can call them and say, do you have a bed? What should I do here? And then also making some kind of law enforcement contact that you can call if you think you have a potential victim, so that they can help you. And sometimes the victims don't want law enforcement involved. It's important to respect that. They may not be ready. They also may have had really bad experiences with law enforcement. And so just building that trust with the victim is critical. And then the hotline number is the other best resource.
Esther, speaking of law enforcement, do you have any kind of interaction or training for law enforcement? I'm a chaplain at the TPD, and so I've been with officers who they treat the victim as a suspect.
Yeah.
How do you train that?
Yeah, I'm really glad you brought that up, and I would be happy to connect with you, and send you my card, and you can pass on TAP resources to TPD. We do train law enforcement directly, so we have an in-person 4-hour-long training block, which is phenomenal. It's done by our deputy director and a survivor together, and they co-present, and the purpose, right, of the survivor is to help break that down for officers, to help humanize them, because historically in law enforcement, they do see the victims as the problem, the criminal, the nuisance, and there's a lot of derogatory thinking and language and treatment of victims. So that's why there's that distrust often between victims and law enforcement. I've known survivors who have been used by law enforcement, many survivors. So the very people that are supposed to protect them and help them have often been the perpetrators. So there's a lot of work to be done there. We have that in-person training. We also have a video, a law enforcement specific training video that I could share with you. That's a great place to start. And then we also have co-created models with law enforcement that look at the intersections between commercial vehicle and law enforcement where they're already interacting, and help build anti-trafficking work there. I will say in Oklahoma, that has been really successful. So we work with Department of Public Safety and Oklahoma State Troopers. We've trained them in depth. But a lot of the more local PDs and sheriffs, it's more making those introductions or connections is how we get those trainings. So, great question.
I just thought of this one when you mentioned about sometimes law enforcement are actually themselves involved as perpetrators themselves. Do you vet the truck drivers? Because I have seen some documentaries where some truck drivers themselves have been involved in trafficking. Do you vet them first before they come on board?
Also a great question. No, we don't, because we work typically with the companies that employ them. And a lot of times these are huge companies, so they don't necessarily know. So, TAP really, as I said at the beginning, we're working to change hearts and minds, knowing that we won't be successful. If there's a buyer out there, if there's a perpetrator, maybe they'll change their mind. But we're really going after all the good men and women who do want to do something. And so what we say about the trucking industry, yes, there's bad actors, bad apples in every industry, in every agency. From doctors and lawyers to truck drivers, they've, that mugshot, right, of the buyers. If we had those occupations or even salary ranges, right, you would see the whole gamut. And so what we do as an organization is we try and say, hey, we're not going to focus on the bad guys, we're going to focus on the good guys. And, one of the imageries I love that we talk about is If that girl has to walk by 8 trucks to get to that 9th truck, who's the buyer? We want to activate those 8 individuals to say something, to get involved, to be the Kevin Kimmels, and make a call. Any other questions? Oh, one back there.
This is not so much a question, but to restate the obvious. You're talking about sometimes the victims are reluctant to get law enforcement involved. But you did say, if you think it's a minor, then all bets are off. They have no say. Basically, they call law enforcement right away whenever there's a minor involved. Is that?
Absolutely, 100%. You are correct. If there is any minor involved, law enforcement needs to be called and needs to be involved. If it's an adult and they do not want law enforcement's involvement, that's when you call the national hotline, and they have, the national hotline has victim services all across the country that they're working with. So whether you're in Alabama, for a driver, Mississippi, Oklahoma, California, wherever they may encounter a victim, they could, provide those resources. And really, we're not encouraging drivers to, to necessarily try and rescue a victim or interact, but especially with our truck stop partners, a lot of times the victims will be using the restroom at the truck stop or coming through, and they're able to see if there's, that controlling behavior or if the pimp is on premise. So if folks find themselves interacting, like your example, Bill, with potential victims, then on our wallet cards we have questions that you can ask that help ascertain what's going on without scaring the victim or saying, are you a trafficking victim? Because they won't know what that is. So yeah, great point. Yeah.
Did you see the movie Sound of Freedom?
I have not.
Oh.
Yeah.
Oh, okay. Well, it was good.
Yeah.
What would be the time frame that you would ask for if you had the opportunity of going before, say, a large group of pastors or church staff to get them initially trained? What would be the time element we would need to ask?
So are you saying like to present the information to them, or?
Yes. To present them, because I would say most people that I know in Oklahoma are many thousands of churches, Southern Baptists. Most of them don't know anything about this.
Yeah.
So if you were speaking at, say, a state convention, how much time would we need to ask those leaders for?
For a presentation time? I mean, our team does them whatever we can get. It really depends on the audience. They were gracious enough to give me an hour, which is way more time than I normally have. So our presentation is usually 30 minutes or shorter, if that's what you're asking. Oh.
Really, just awareness.
Okay. So he's asking about awareness, not necessarily in-depth training.
Yeah. I think I'd have to get back with you on the best resource for a group of pastors. Our training, all of our video training or presentation awareness, general training would be like 15 to 30 minutes. You can cover it pretty well. But if you're wanting something more in-depth, and probably here in the state, there would be folks on the state task force that would be best suited to train here locally.
So Esther, would your organization be interested in speaking to a large group of pastors, or is that sort of out of your lane and you refer it to this last resource you've stated?
Yeah, I would probably refer that out just because it's not our wheelhouse. I am here local, based here in Tulsa, so I mean, I'm open to that if that's the best fit, but typically we would refer that to somebody who directly works with church leaders.
I think maybe what might fascinate Bob is we're a group of ministry leaders representing different churches, organizations, and this has been a wake-up. So stepping into his Southern Baptist organization, it's the wake-up.
Okay. Yeah, I'd be open to that if it's local. If it's, if it's national, there may be somebody better suited. The other thing I think you bring up is that our churches are not very aware of this, are they? And both in schools and in churches, this topic gets pushed back because, as you have experienced, it's not an easy one. It's not, it's a little bit messy, right? And they're hard topics to cover. So, historically, I think in church, this type of presentation is a little bit taboo or outside the norm or people's comfort zone. But I think that's changing. And so, it's all about just providing the opportunity or the platform.
Let's take one more question, Tim.
One more question.
Okay.
And everybody get your hand clappers ready to go in a little bit, okay? Get them warmed up.
I'm curious, you mentioned you guys operate in Mexico also. So how does that look like? Do you have, is it mostly on the border? Is it inside the country? Do you have cooperation with the local police, with the government? How does it look like?
Yeah, great question. You guys are full of great questions. I have to say, usually this is not my typical audience, but I love it.
We only bring in the best.
I see that. So in Mexico, we have our model replicated. So in other words, there's not a Truckers Against Trafficking in Mexico, but we partner with a nonprofit called El Pozo. And then the hotline there, which is run by Consejo Ciudadano. And all of this is on our website, but we basically came in as the consultants to say, here's what worked in the U.S., now let's make this in a Mexican context work. So there's a program there called, and don't judge me on my Spanish, Guardianes del Asfalto. So Guardians of the Asphalt is what they named their program there. And so there's a short training video, some wallet cards, posters. We actually have our busing on the lookout posters up in all of the bus terminals across Mexico, which is pretty incredible, 10,000 of those posters. And those posters are really for victims to see as they may be boarding a bus or trying to escape a trafficker, to see those resources. Has been a lot longer of a process. We do have some partners in the federal law enforcement, but the whole process is just a little slower moving. So, yeah.
Put those hand clappers together. Thank you, everybody, for coming. Just a few things I'd like to go over with you quick. But thank you. Was that worth your time?
Yes.
We really appreciate that. Our next seminar will be in February. We can't tell you if it's here or there. For those of you that have come regularly, we typically meet at Laureate on the campus of St. Francis, the psychiatric hospital location over there. They're doing some remodeling work. That brought us here today. Excuse me. So we'll keep you posted. We have your email, and we may see you over there in February. We would like for you, if you would, take some time to fill out that eval form. Esther would appreciate seeing that. If you have any input for us as to the type of topics you would like to see us address in the future, we'd appreciate you putting a note down to that effect. I mentioned that you can look on our website to discover our varied offerings Bright Tomorrows makes available, and that we do not charge, but we do accept offerings. There's an offering envelope. If you're able to help us this morning, just leave that on the middle of your table and accept my thank you. Now, she has mentioned connecting with her. She had that up on the screen. I think it's still on the screen, Tim, behind me, the contact information. There are some business cards back at the table in the direction I'm pointing, and a number of other items that she mentioned, hard copy-wise, are at that table. Tim, anything I've missed? Jim, Jay, got it covered? God bless you. Have a wonderful day. Thank you for your ministry. Did you get through it?
Yeah, I just turned it off. Is there something else?
No.
Just
No.
wait and let
And-
Tim
and-
do the rest.
Yeah, you didn't need me on there, and you didn't need it.
Well,
anything
they
but
can
her.
cut that off.
But the editor will take care of that. Yeah.
That's what I figured. I just left it, kept it going.
I'll just double check with him that I'm turning it off correct, but
Okay.
thank you, Steve, for that.
I think we can just probably hit the on off.
I think so. That's what I